Actually, Joan did a great job, and I didn't prosecute Lenny Bruce. I interviewed Lenny Bruce. Actually, I was in college, and I was on the debating team at the University of California at Berkeley, and one of our topics was First Amendment free speech, and one of my professors was his lawyer. And I went to visit him and interviewed him. And for about 2 hours, he regaled me not only with credible humor, but an enormous knowledge of the First Amendment. But he was prosecuted by the Manhattan DA's office. Those things changed in the period of time from the years when I was at Berkeley. Also, when I was at Berkeley, I will tell you, I was there from 61 to 68. That was like pre-revolutionary Berkeley, revolutionary Berkeley, and post-revolutionary Berkeley. I had occasion to meet both President Kennedy, who spoke for the first time in a public institution in 1962, and I met him, and I then met Dr. Martin Luther King, who spoke at the steps of Sproul Hall, never dreaming that I would someday go to Washington and be involved in the investigations of two extraordinary Americans. But, and you're right, Joan, I would attest to L.J. Delsa, who I asked to work on the committee because he had worked with me in a case of some extremists who came to New York and assassinated 2 New York City police officers. And thereafter they fled back to California and ultimately to New Orleans. And that's when I met him during the course of that prosecution investigation. We're pretty much the same group that was here today, this morning, when Senator Specter was here. Is that fair to say? I didn't really come this way to debate Senator Specter, although I would do it at any time. But when you have Mark Lane sitting here, he makes me look like a conciliatory person, and that's something that is an uncommon role for me to play. But I guess I could, in order to give you a preview of the candidate I'd like to get involved with you about, I will tell you a story about President Kennedy. And it took place when he was campaigning for the Democratic primary in 1960. And he was in West Virginia. And he was meeting some coal miners, and he wanted to demonstrate that he was a person of the people and that he wasn't just a rich son of a wealthy man. He was a junior senator from Massachusetts, and when he met these coal miners, he was shaking hands. It was a perfect photo opportunity. He was in his cashmere coat, his wingtip shoes, his Brooks Brothers suit, his muffler, and one of the coal miners at 6 o'clock in the morning stopped in front of him and said, "Senator, is it true that you've never worked a day in your life?" And JFK sort of looked immediately to his left and his right, and yes, the press was hanging on his answer and heard the question. And the senator looked at the coal miner and said, "I guess you can say that's true." To which the coal miner replied, "Senator, I want to tell you something. You're not missing a goddamn thing." Now, when I went to Washington, it had been after years and years in my career directly out of law school in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. I was always somewhat suspect by many in the New York NYPD because I had spent 7 years at Berkeley. And the cases that we handled were not as basically has been alluded to this morning by Senator Specter, that is to say, when asked about serious contradictions in your case, and your reply is, "We had a strong case, but the evidence doesn't hold," and the reply is, "We had a strong case." It almost becomes pathological. How do you have a strong case if you don't have any evidence? And it's the duty of the prosecutor, the district attorney, to test before you submit it to a jury the trustworthy nature of what the evidence is, so that you cross-examine your own witnesses. You don't wait for a Mark Lane to do it or anybody else. And when cross-examination takes place in the courtroom, you just get out more evidence and more evidence because the witnesses have been prepared. And that's the way cases should be handled, because the prosecution has a tremendous advantage. They move all the chess pieces, if you're competent and honest with honest cases, before the defense ever is called to the table. It's all been tested. And it's very troublesome to hear the senator, and the gentleman I mentioned this morning, who's a judge now in Ohio, as he said it 10 years ago, it took me 10 years to recover, it'll take me another 10 years from this morning session, I'm sure. But to simply say, yes, we had a great case, or yes, we knew that our investigators couldn't be trusted, but we still went forward. We weren't preparing this case, the senator said. We weren't preparing this case, he said, for a trial. Well, what was he preparing the case for? What was the nature of this investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy? This was a murder case, a homicide. Now, I will tell you, I have in my life worked for the Congress of the United States. I've worked with some people in Hollywood, and I've investigated and prosecuted members of organized crime. And without question, the only people whose word you can trust, regrettably, are people who are in organized crime. And so the question arises, what is involved with this Congress and investigating a murder case? They are, I will tell you, the last organization, institution in America that should investigate a case. Because there is no political way to gather evidence. There's no Republican way, Democratic way, liberal way, conservative way to evaluate evidence. And when you're in the Congress, there are 435 bosses. And they have all their staff people, their administrative aides, their legislative aides, and they all insist that they want to know what is going on. And then they'll leak various pieces of information. I will tell you, we had no political constituency. The liberals were afraid that the committee was going to somehow embarrass Dr. King and President Kennedy because of various activities that they were involved in. The conservatives were afraid that we would somehow embarrass the executive intelligence agencies. And so we lost our constituency. And they held up the funding of the committee. And I was asked by the committee to go around and meet with the members of the House of Representatives. It was precisely these kinds of things that, A, I never contemplated because I was too naive, and B, if I did contemplate it, I never would have gone to Washington. And I will tell you that after meeting with the 435 representatives, I would go home to my wife and ask the following question: how did these people get elected? You sit on the House floor, as I did when the committee was voted on, and they wave a piece of paper that is a Picayune Journal article as if you were waving, it was Moses coming down with the tablets as evidence. What I'd like to do very briefly is to explain some of the reasons why, from a prosecutorial point of view, from what our investigation revealed, there was, in my judgment, no case to ever convict Lee Harvey Oswald of murdering the president. But then again, the LA DA's office couldn't convict OJ, so it's not as though I'm saying blanketly he's innocent. But what I am saying is, from the evidence that we adduced, there were substantial questions that unfortunately Senator Specter left and we couldn't get to. And the first one was the following. And again, when you hear from the experts, and there's disputes between Dr. Bodden and other medical people, and doctors like Gary Aguilar, who is a brilliant individual who has dedicated an incredible amount of time, they know the details about the medical evidence, the ballistic evidence, but it's an overview, I think, that one has to have to appreciate why there really is no case. That is to say, how is it that the police the cornerstone of truth in every case. How is it that the police, out of the cosmos, focused on the defendant? What led them to that? What was the trail? That's the credibility, the truth of your case. In our case, the Kennedy assassination, the first question was, how was it that Oswald was stopped by Tippit during the course and flow of the investigation that was happening so rapidly? And to almost all Americans, myself included, as I was coming out of a philosophy lecture, I will admit a little earlier, and heard the word spread around the campus in a cascading fashion that the president had been shot. It was unfathomable they were talking about President Kennedy. I thought we were more civilized than that. How is it during the course of this investigation that within an hour and a half, a couple of miles away, a police officer was able to stop Oswald, according to the Warren Commission, because he fit the description that was sent out on the radio to the police at 12:48 p.m. The assassination was approximately 12:30. At 12:48. And the answer the Warren Commission gives is that this fellow Brennan was standing at the angle of the hypotenuse of a right triangle, as I am, looking up now at the depository window. And he allegedly sees this person, the shooter, Oswald, the Warren Commission maintains, and he's able to give a description. A miraculous feat, as Mark Lane indicated this morning, because Mark said if he stood up in the window, you would only see a partial of his body, because the first 4 feet was opaque. But we know, even more than that, because of the great work that was done by Robert Groden, who helped me and the committee and made a major contribution to the American people because of his work and devotion. We know from the photographs that he collected and gave to the committee, the used photographs show before the assassination and after the assassination, within 15 to 30 seconds, nobody's in that window. So whoever the shooter was did not stand up and say, "Hooray, I just murdered the president." Whoever the shooter was, if they were in that window at the sniper's nest, was crouched down in the sniper's nest, looking out that window, which was raised about 12 inches. At best, if anybody saw anybody in that window, they would have had a partial of their face, at best. Brennan claims that he gave this description up. But the question is, who did he give it up to? One naturally thinks he gave it to the Dallas police, because they're the ones who sent the wire out at 12:48. That justifies the Tippit stop. And in fact, what happened was, he gave it to the Secret Service, to Forrest Sorrells, who came back after 1 o'clock. He came back from Parkland Hospital because all of the people, Secret Service people that were at Dallas, were in the motorcade. And they went to Parkland. Now again, as I said this morning with respect to the gaping hole in the back of the president's head, it's just a kind of a story that someone would forget that, well, I don't know, I may have given it to a police officer or the Secret Service. How many people here have met a Secret Service agent the day the president was assassinated, and you gave a description of someone who might have been the killer? Is that an individual you would forget? But Sorrells corroborates what he says. And so we know, in some fashion, a description went out that wasn't given from the person that the Warren Commission alleges, and we're confronted with the problem of who gave this description. That is, who gave the description who allegedly was at the crime scene, as opposed to who may have given that description sometime prior to that. Now when you start breaking this case down without having to go into the weight of Exhibit 399, the pristine bullet, and getting into much more sophisticated information, we heard today that the rifle that was found by Officer Craig, I discuss Officer Craig not the other officer he was with, because Craig was voted Cop of the Year in Dallas. In order to be Cop of the Year, it doesn't qualify you to be a member of the ACLU or to be honored by them. Not in Dallas. He wrote down in his memo book that he found a German Mauser. Now, it's very simple for a senator to say, we have a strong case. It was a Mannlicher Carcano. But you have to explain to the public, to the jury, to the American people, how it was that a police officer found the German Mauser when it must be a Mannlicher Carcano, because that's what that bullet matches in the hospital, even though it can't be identified as the same bullet by the person who found it. But giving them their due, they're claiming that the bullet that was in the hospital is consistent with being fired from the Mannlicher Carcano. The linkage evidence needed to tie Oswald down because of him allegedly purchasing it from the mail order house in Chicago. The other area of interest for us was specifically when the shots were fired. One of the tests of credibility are what people spontaneously do. They have no time to fabricate, they respond, and that's why we have that spontaneous utterance that is admissible as hearsay, because of its very nature. We believe it to be trustworthy. When the shots were fired, from everything that we learned during the course of the investigation very quickly, was that a group of people ran to the grassy knoll and some people ran to the book depository. And the people who ran to the grassy knoll, including one police officer, withdrew his service revolver, pointed at somebody beyond the fence who was wearing a suit, and that person stopped and flashed a Secret Service identification. Simultaneously, officers running into the book depositories had a couple of people running out and they flashed Secret Service identification. The problem is, as I just mentioned, all the Secret Service people were in the motorcade. And the question arises, who were these people? What, if anything, was done by the Warren Commission to suggest that there may have been some other people involved? The major area of concern occurred while we were going through the various issues. The Parkland Hospital was a very significant issue of those doctors who had signed off on the gaping hole in the back of the president's head. I'm not a scientist. I asked Dr. Michael Bodden, a dear friend and a trusted colleague, someone I have the utmost respect for, to organize the medical examiner team, the forensic pathologists, and as I said this morning, wanted Dr. Cyril to be in that group. But there's a common sense rule that applies, isn't there? If someone is shot, if I am hit right now, if you were to walk up here and strike me in the head, it is more than not likely that I would move my head if you struck me in the front of my head backwards. This was sort of physics 101 in high school, with the cue ball hitting the 8 ball hitting the other ball. They sort of all move in that direction. I now have a better understanding and appreciation for my physics teacher as I watch this simplistic example being explained to us. How is it that if the people in Parkland are telling the truth, and half of the president's head falls down over his ear, as you see the Zapruder film, and we have the gaping hole in the back, that if he was shot from the back, and that injury occurred, why is there no injury in the front of the president's face? Now, I have never gotten an explanation from anyone about that. And as I said, my only disagreement with my dear friend, Dr. Bodden, is the provenance of the exhibits that he's shown, their legitimacy. During the course of the investigation, a fascinating issue occurred. I had sent Gaten Fonzie and Detective Al Gonzalez from New York, who had trained me when I was a young assistant DA. He was a homicide detective handling what we called Manhattan North, which was north of 59th Street. And they went down to Miami. And in Miami, they were working with Antonio Vecchiano, Alpha 66 people, and we were trying to find out who Maurice Bishop was. And as time went on, it became apparent that Maurice Bishop was David Phillips. And so we brought David Phillips up, and right at that time, this extraordinary historical character came into my office. I had never met him, but of course I had known about him. I read his book, which I enjoyed thoroughly, and I enjoy books, so I'm one who encourages people to read a lot. And he came and he introduced himself, and he gave me, and he was very cautious about his introduction. He was fearful that I was this hard-nosed prosecutor from Manhattan, and I was probably going to whitewash the whole goddamn thing anyway. But he wanted to hand me the document, and he did, and I read the document. He obtained it from the Freedom of Information Act. It was all verified. And it was extraordinary. And it ultimately led to the complete stalemate between the staff and the committee. And here's what happened. And this will tell you more about why the Congress should never investigate a case like this. Never. Because there can be no compromise on truth. That's not what goes on in this business. And again, I'll repeat this. You don't take evidence as a prosecutor and just slop it in front of a jury. You don't get somebody indicted, wreck their life, have them defend, spend every cent they have, destroy their family and their reputation, and say, okay, jury, if you acquit, that's your business. You carefully, thoroughly examine the evidence. That's your responsibility as the representative of the people. And you don't put on every eyewitness, as was said this morning by the senator. You don't just throw on every eyewitness. You put on witnesses of value. And if there are eyewitnesses who you are not putting on, you give them to the defense. And you have reasons why you haven't put them on. And what happened here was, in comes Phillips. Executive committee questions, and he says, with respect to the Oswald appearance, I should say the Lee Henry Oswald appearance, because that's what the government said on October 1st, on or about October 1st, 1963. The Lee Henry Oswald appearance in Mexico City, and the Russian embassy calling the Cuban embassy, wanting to get transportation to clearance to Havana and then to Moscow or wherever. And he insisted on having a Russian interpreter, this Lee Henry Oswald, even though the historical Oswald spoke fluent Russian. And he kept insisting on the phone that he was Lee Henry Oswald, knowing that this bugging was going on between U.S. and communist embassies. They bugged us, we bugged them. Sort of a James Bond thing. And Phillips said that the tape of that conversation, after we demonstrated, of course, that the photo on the telex is not the historical Lee Harvey Oswald, he said the photographic equipment broke down. And the wrong person was put on, and the identification of that person was that of the person who appeared on the photograph, not the historical Lee Harvey Oswald. So it was a lot more than just having the photographic equipment break down. You would have the right description, you would have the wrong photo. Nevertheless, when asked where the tape was, he indicated that the tape had been recycled. Because I asked him of economies, we wanted to save money on tapes. Yes. So if asked on October 30th, this happened on October 1st allegedly, if on October 30th you were asked, where's the tape? The answer was, I don't have that tape, we recycled it. Mark Lane gave me this document. The detective, Cliff Fenton, with whom I had worked on many cases, I asked to then hand out this memo. We gave it to Phillips. Phillips read it. The memo was from J. Edgar Hoover, dated November 23rd, 1963. It was from J. Edgar Hoover to supervisorial personnel, FBI. And it said, our agents who were questioning Lee Harvey Oswald for the last 17 hours have listened to the tape of October 1st, 1963 in Mexico City from an individual identified as Lee Henry Oswald. And the voice on the tape, our agents say, is not the voice of Lee Harvey Oswald. Phillips took that, put it in his pocket, and walked out. The committee, I informed, was just visited with contempt and perjury. And in order to deal with that effectively, my recommendation was to invite him back with his counsel and to have him purge himself, because we were not a grand jury. We weren't looking to indict anybody. We wanted to get information. He had vital information. The committee refused to get involved. Once we made that connection, and I kept demanding that we bring him back, the following occurred in the search for the truth. Keep in mind, these are the people who we elect. These are the people who we send to Washington. And this is what they did. They turned off our telephones. We couldn't make long-distance telephone calls. They took away our franking privileges. We couldn't send out letters. Well, we could have and put our own stamps on. And they prevented us from traveling. That was the nature of the investigation at that point. I then continued, during the course of that investigation, to press the CIA and the FBI for documents. And they insisted that the only documents that we would get would be redacted. And I did not respond favorably to that notion. Now, I didn't go to Andover or Exeter, and if you go to Ellis Island, you'll see where my grandparents came from. But I learned about the two promissory notes early on in my life that guide every American. And that's the Constitution of the United States of America and the Declaration of Independence. And I was calling in those promises. I wonder who, in fact, decides who reads unredacted documents. I never saw one document that in any way not only should never have been redacted, but in any way should have been preserved for the year 2080 or whatever. What kind of show is that? What are they afraid of? There are no sources and methods. This was a murder case. The only source and method we would have found out is who in fact killed the president. And that's what we were supposed to do. I thought back when I realized now, then meeting again the members of the committee, of the House, and reporting back to Richard Sprague, who was then chief counsel, that we couldn't very well continue. And I thought and I told him that what is galling about this is that people who read unredacted documents are people who probably went to Andover and Exeter and Dartmouth. And probably people like Mr. McNamara, the Secretary of Defense. Mr. McNamara and those like him, but particularly Mr. McNamara, when he testified before the United States Senate in 1964, raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth before Almighty God, lied. And the magnitude of his lie, that there was a North Vietnamese ship that attacked American ships on or about August 2nd and August 9th, 1964, and from which the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave authority to the president to pursue the war in Vietnam, was a monstrous lie. Years later, he went back and visited with General Giap, G-I-A-P, of the North Vietnamese forces, and asked him, he said, "General, what in fact happened on August 2nd and August 9th? And the general said, "Nothing. Nothing." I was on a book tour several years ago, and I was watching before I was waiting for an NBA final game to come on in the city I was in. And I switched to C-SPAN, and Charles Lamb was interviewing an author. And I was stopped by the questions and the answers. And it was a very close-up shot, a bust of the person being interviewed. One only saw stomach area and up. And the person said, I was an alcoholic, I became a drug addict, I begged my wife to leave me. I didn't want my son to do what I did. And he had written a book that was a Pulitzer Prize book called Favorite Son. He is the son of Chesty Puller, who was the most decorated Marine in the 20th century. Entered World War I as an enlisted man, became a general, and every night, basically at Paris Island, young Marines say goodnight, Chesty. And his son was being interviewed. I had never seen him, but I'd heard of his book. And the camera then withdrew, and I saw that he had no legs. And then I noticed when he picked up his water, his hand was webbed. He had stepped on a landmine. He was in Vietnam for about 8 weeks. And because the medevac units, unlike in Korea, were so high-tech, we pulled people off the battlefield who we left for dead before. And 500,000 people like this young man gave their body parts to this war that was a lie. McNamara should be in jail. But he gets to read unredacted documents. The reason I mention this is because if I say to you that 59,000 people were killed in Vietnam and 500,000 are in hospitals, it's the equivalent of my saying to you and you saying to me, 53,000 Americans died at Gettysburg on July 4th weekend in 1863. Where's the connection? Where's that connection between the horror, the nightmare of the injustices that occur when a war is a fake and based on a lie? And that's when I told Richard Sprague that I could not continue in this investigation because I did not want to be part of a historical record that in any way was less than truthful. That I would never do what I had seen done. It wasn't worth it to me, and I wasn't about to start that, and I certainly didn't want my partner in life, to whom I've committed my life and my children, to live with a fake. And I told Dick that we had to leave. We called the committee members. They then begged Dick to stay. They really didn't mean it. That's what goes on in Washington. And he left. I stayed for the transition. And I was there on the floor when they voted for the committee. I didn't want him to make an issue of it, frankly, because I didn't want the historical investigation to stop. That is to say, I don't have a monopoly on right and wrong. I'm telling you what my perceptions and my reality was. And if the Congress decided that it wanted to go forward with a phony investigation, then shame on that Congress and shame on those people. Because the truth will out. I just wonder whether or not these people have any soul. The soul is non-negotiable. And the soul of our country is embodied in those two promissory notes. And I wasn't going to be part of it in any way besmirching that soul. And so we left. One of the records that I came across that stunned me, and to this day still does, and it tells us a great deal about the nature of certain people who are in the government and what their reactions are, and about their lack of soul and the corrupt nature of what they do, because they misinform the public, and the public gets a misunderstanding of what the job nature is of what they're supposed to do and deliver. And this record that I found was Executive Committee transcript before the Chief Justice, for whom I have the utmost respect. He was a DA of Alameda County, he was Attorney General of California, he was governor, ran for president, and was on the vice presidential ticket in '48, and of course became Chief Justice when he was appointed by President Eisenhower. But he revolutionized a lot of things. He made real, he overturned, in my judgment, the second worst Supreme Court opinion ever, Plessy v. Ferguson, and Brown v. Board of Education. He made real the notion that at least separate schools wouldn't be tolerated. And he gave life to a lot of things in the criminal justice. I mean, could it be any more un-American than to try an indigent who has no lawyer and send him to prison? Can you imagine going home and telling your mother on Friday night, she says, "What did you do today as a prosecutor?" "Well, I convicted 5 individuals of burglary, assault, and felonies," and so on. And how was their lawyer? Oh, they had no lawyer. That's not the nature, the fundamental nature of America as I understand it. There is a notion of fairness. And that is a pivotal role. And I don't know that Senator Specter understood that. A pivotal role for people in the government, particularly in the areas that affect us so dramatically in criminal justice, because it dramatically affects our manner in which we conduct our lives. And the transcript read between, as best my recollection is, the third week in January 1964, 3 people went to see the Chief Justice. Wagner Carr, the Attorney General of Texas, Leon Jaworski, his chief assistant counsel, who then became chief counsel 10 years later to the Watergate Committee, as we know him, as most people came to know him, and Henry Wade, the DA of Dallas. And they said, using their language, from unimpeachable sources, we have information that Lee Harvey Oswald, in fact, was a contract employee for the CIA and for the FBI. And the Chief Justice said, well, we'll investigate that. Not so fast, said Allen Dulles, formerly head, as you know, of the CIA during the Bay of Pigs and removed by President Kennedy, a commissioner on the Warren Commission. What do you mean not so fast, says the Chief Justice? Well, if you ask J. Edgar Hoover whether or not Oswald was a contract employee, he'll say no. You know, he's very upset with us because he's already determined, as of December 9th, that Oswald did it, he did it alone without foreign intervention. There's written memos to that effect. And the Chief Justice said, you mean to tell me, this is all on transcript, you mean to tell me that if I were to call an agent in here, he would lie? Think about that. Chief Justice of the United States of America. This is the head rabbi here. And he's saying to a Warren commissioner, removed by the president, who was assassinated, you mean to tell me that if I were to call an agent in here, he would lie to me? And to which Dulles responds, if he were a good agent, he would. Well, says the Chief Justice, who will he tell the truth to? Maybe, comma, maybe the president, says Allen Dulles. And that is, sums up, I guess, what one is up against. But I don't say this with the notion that we leave here today with our tails between our legs and say, it's too overwhelming, let's just give up. What I urge is that we speak to our congresspeople, and we urge people in our community who are independent and fair-minded, who have worked for a living at some time in their life, who understand what it means to support other people, to run for public office. President Kennedy ironically said it best. He said, throughout the long history of the world, only a few generations of Americans, and only a few generations ever, have been called upon and afforded the opportunity to defend freedom in its hour of maximum danger. We are in battle today. We have the reality of what President Kennedy's vision was of the dangers that we faced in 1961 when he gave his inaugural address. And the very first step in the battle that we face today, it seems to me, is not only that we speak the truth and search for it, but that we demand from our government in this battle that our government tells us the truth. And if we can do that, then we will have taken a major, major first step in defeating the terror that befalls us. Thank you all very much.